So today's the State of the Union. Racquel is going to take all of our good conversation back to the president directly. So, when we get to conversation, nice sound bites so it can get slipped into the speech, and we'll check in the morning. I'm sure Duffy's taking time off from being on the calls as well as many other folks around the table here. But women in the economy, the untapped engine, this is a very important topic. The Ascend program here, just very briefly, we are really meant to serve as a hub for both parents, especially women and their children, and looking for where are the breakthrough ideas and the proven strategies that can break the cycle of generational poverty through economic security and educational success. Our work is really focused on how we fundamentally change the conversation. Today is sort of a piece of that with our other colleague partners. How do we build leadership networks that can build the political will? We need political will both from the inside and the outside to make the kind of change. And lastly, how are we elevating up the best community solutions and best practices out there and pushing that into good policy that affects real people's lives? With that said, this is a great conversation, great people in the room. We are very, very fortunate to have David Leonhardt here to moderate this panel. Of course, we asked him months ago. He did not know this was the State of the Union. He had to say goodbye to the White House to be here. So it's a big deal to be the Washington bureau chief for the New York Times on the day of the State of the Union and be here with us. But as many of you have read, we were all thrilled with his appointment to be the bureau chief. I miss reading his work on a more regular basis. He was an incredible writer and reporter on these issues of everything from healthcare to the economy to women, and the way in which he covered it was just with incredible depth and understanding. His column, The Economic Scene, we still get to see that pop up every once in a while, never enough for all of us, but has been just one of the shining spotlights of sort of A-grade journalism, and we're delighted that he's now taking that into his leadership and management role as the bureau chief. He is, in addition to his work as a Times reporter and a bureau chief, has written for the magazine, has written for the Washington Post and Business Week. We're thrilled, and we celebrated with him. You don't know, we didn't pop quite as much champagne, but also in April of 2011 when he won the Pulitzer Prize. And I just want to read one little piece that came out from the Pulitzer board. He was really honored and raised up for his graceful penetration of America's complicated economic questions, from the federal budget to healthcare reform. This is a person who, we all look for silver bullets. They don't exist. These are big issues, big politics. And David has the kind of values to ask the right questions. He's the father of boys and girls, cares a lot about the roles of moms and dads. So we sort of think of him as a Renaissance reporter, in addition to everything else. So with that said, David, he's a member of the Aspen community for many programs. On behalf of Walter and the whole team, we're thrilled to have you here.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for that extremely nice introduction. I appreciate it. It's great to be back. I was last at an Ascend event, which was A, in Aspen rather than Washington, and B, people were drinking at it. We'll have to figure out a way to have even more fun. It's really wonderful to be back here. I'm looking forward to another good discussion here. Every time I've been here, we've had a good discussion of some kind. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists here. Then they're each going to take just a couple minutes to give you a sense of some of their thoughts. And then we're going to have a discussion among the four of us and then open it up to the whole table. So let me start. Barbara Krumsiek, who is sitting on the end here, is the chief executive of Calvert Investments. One of the things that struck me when reading your bio, Barbara, is you and I have a number of things in common. We are both New Yorkers who majored in math in college and now live in Washington. The difference is that you majored in math and got a Phi Beta Kappa. I'll end the sentence there. You not only manage a whole lot of money, but Barbara is a longtime advocate for promoting women's roles in various professions, not just her own. Closest to me is Racquel Russell, who is here from the White House. Racquel at the White House works on the Domestic Policy Council and is focused on a number of areas there, both the healthcare law, which is obviously extremely important, and also on some of the work the White House has been trying to do on mobility. I don't know if you've read any of this in the New York Times. We had a big article, but mobility is really a rising concern because we think of ourselves as an opportunity society, and in many ways we are, but we're not as much of one as as we think of. And in fact, when you look at economic mobility, the likelihood of moving from one class to another in a lifetime, it is lower in this country than it is in many other rich countries, despite our more egalitarian culture than those other rich countries like Europe, which is something a lot of people are focusing on. Celinda Lake, if you know politics, you know her name. She is not only a long-time person involved in American politics, but she's also been involved overseas in countries with not nearly the democratic history that we have, like South Africa and Eastern Europe. Before it's out, we may ask you if you'll give us some sort of prognostication about the Republican race, but we'll save that to the end. So let's start on the far end with Barbara, and then make our way. We'll go to Celinda and then Racquel, and then we'll open up the conversation. Thank you all for being here.
Oh, thank you, David. It's an honor to be here. I come out of the corporate world, and while a focus here is poverty, I talk about working women, and there are many low-wage working women, and that is the step out of poverty as a job. So let me just share my approach to this. We're an investment firm. We invest in companies to make money for our shareholders, for retirement, for college savings. We run the DC 529 plan here in the district. We want to make money, and we believe gender equality is important within a company in order to advance the interest of that company. There's a self-interest there. So Calvert, when I joined Calvert as CEO 15 years ago, always had a focus on gender in the workplace. But there were very few tools to measure how companies treated women. There was EEOC data, which was not necessarily shared, and all it was counting. You tried to count the number of women on the boards. So I think Calvert over the last decade has taken a more sophisticated look at women's issues within the workplace, identifying assumptions such as continuous employment. We deal with outcomes and policies, but the reality is the U.S. workforce grew up on the notion of continuous employment, and women don't have continuous employment. They have breaks in service. And so getting at that, and we may deal with it through workplace flexibility or through Family and Medical Leave Acts and that sort of thing, but the bottom line is that assumption of continuous employment. Until we get at that, we really can't totally solve the problem. My goal, and the White House is at the table, so I'll say it is, under the Bush administration, a 401k catch-up was introduced for age. So if you're 50, 55 or over, which I don't really know anything about it, I just read about it. But anyway, there's a catch-up provision if you're over a certain age. Well, what about a catch-up provision if you have a break in service? Women who leave the workforce for 2-3 years. Why isn't there a $5,000 catch-up for that? I mean, so in any event, continuous employment still exists. And then there's all the social negatives that women face: lack of ambition, talent, can't negotiate, et cetera. So Calvert's done 2 signature projects. One is, as Ann mentioned, the women's empowerment principles, and I just happen to have a half dozen handouts of that too. We just looked at corporate culture, and we worked with the UN, with UNIFEM, because the workforce is a global workforce. And what we think of as U.S. companies may have majority non-U.S. Women workers. And we developed a set of 7 principles for how to create a workplace that is supportive for women, includes safety and many things we don't often think of as issues. And when we launched this at the UN 6 years ago, we had Starbucks, Dell, and Pfizer show up and want to be with us at the launch. Sweet. They need the tools too. They need them. So we don't develop principles or policies. We're an investment firm. So we donated the intellectual property at their request to the UN, and these are now the UN Women's Empowerment Principles, and they're part of UN Women. So that's one step we took. The other is on board diversity. Pay equity, one point I'll make, pay equity, which hits at women of low wages, is a pervasive, troubling issue. And we've thought about it. We've tried to figure out ways to work with it as investors. It's hard. But what my favorite piece of academic research is from the University of North Carolina, working for the woman, female managers, and the gender wage gap. We have people that survey this research, and guess what? When there's a woman among the top 5 paid people in public companies, pay equity improves to 91 cents on a dollar.
Oh, wow.
So you have a woman at the top. It's not that they're setting the pay policy, but they get to see it. There's transparency, and people behave better. So we have started to really lobby more for women in board levels and at senior management levels, because that helps women at the bottom, at the entry levels. Thank you.
Thank you. Celinda?
Thank you. Well, first of all, it's great to be here. It's a real honor to be with you. And I want to say it's always an honor to be with Anne, who's just, I think, one of the most visionary leaders that we have and innovative leaders for women. And I want to thank Aspen. I want to point out, too, and emphasize, although my remarks are going to be about the voters, that we have done some work on the Ascend program, the two-generational strategy on poverty and education. And I think that it really is at the nexus of what voters are looking for, which is cost-effective new approaches that are anchored on education and families. So I really encourage you to find out more about that. But I have been privileged. I, too, am only theoretically interested in the catch-up provision. And Anne and I started working in kindergarten. You know that book, Everything You Need to Know You Learn in Kindergarten? Well, Anne and I were there together. But we have had the chance to work together over a long period of time, and there are many in this room, Kathy Bonk and others, who have been part of this, of looking at women's data since 1992 and really looking at women's economic data. And that work has been continued by Ms. and by WOW and by others. But the women's voices, it seems odd now, but women's voices was an effort to really bring women's voices and their experience to the economic arena. And now that seemed as pretty standard, but at the time it was pretty revolutionary. And thanks to Anne and others' commitments, and Linda Tarwalen, that group was really committed also to looking at women of color. And it was, I come from Montana. We used to talk all the time about having Native American women involved in the effort, and people used to think, oh, isn't that cute? She's from Montana. But women's voices really followed that commitment and brought in the voices of Latinas, of African American women, Asian American women, and Native American women. So there are 4 trends that came out of that data that I think are useful for us. The first, and that study is from 1992 to 2011, that by hook or by crook it's been patched together. The first is that work was always very values-oriented. Women are very values-oriented in their work, and it started out in the research. We were testing the language, balancing work and family, and I'll never forget the blue-collar women who said, you know, that's briefcase-carrying women talk. We don't balance our work and family. We work for our families, and we juggle it, and sometimes you worry about it all hitting you at once, but we don't balance our work and family. And women have evolved in their what value they valued the most. There was, when we started out, women wanted equality. Then they wanted respect. My favorite period was when they just wanted control. Forget the respect, but just be in charge. Now they want stability, and stability actually even more than security. And this notion of the discontinuous work, men are having a lot of involuntary discontinuous work now too. And women firmly believe this economy is very, very unstable, and so that it's very hard to plan. You can have the best intentions, and your pension and everything else can be completely disrupted through no actions of your own. The second thing we looked at is, who am I? There have been dramatic shifts in the roles of women and in the perception of women. It was interesting to watch when women wanted money the most. Then they said, you know what's even more valuable to me than money is time. That's a commodity for me. I need policies that help promote time. We've seen an enormous change in terms of married versus unmarried women. And now we have 50% of America is unmarried. We've hit that threshold. Tremendous societal changes in the future. It's unclear what will happen, but Gen Y, the youngest people, the most committed among women to make the decision to have children independent of the decision to get married. Now, unclear whether they'll actually act on that, and economically, that is a very profound decision, but the most committed generation we've ever had to separating those two decisions. The caretaker role, and we're all very familiar with it, but it was actually women's voices that first identified the sandwich generation and the real role that women were playing in not just caring for their kids, but also caring for aging parents, and the profound change that had on policy. The third trend we identified in women's voices, which I always love, is the more things change, the more they stay the same. So it's very interesting what you said about pay equity, because pay equity remains a top issue for women. Women really believe that women are not paid the same as men. That yes, you can get the same entry level, but you don't get the same promotion. And it is a very, very powerful economic issue. Women now, half of women now say they bring in the majority or half of the income in their families. Men are completely committed to pay equity. My favorite group were UAW male workers 20 years ago who said, if my wife doesn't get paid the same, I have to pick up more hours. This was very transactional for men, and a huge policy for women. And when we started to talk about 76 cents on the dollar, or 83 cents, or 91 cents, whatever it is, women said, you know, you're calculating that wrong. It isn't just the pay. It affects retirement. It affects benefits. It affects pensions. It affects your leave. Women said, you've got the wrong mathematical formula in your head for that. It is far more profound than the 76 cents on the dollar. Women have also brought this to procurement, and in fact, you know, we don't mean to all lobby you, but it's good to have you here. One of the most interesting policies, women want to start small businesses. A majority of women now want to start their own small businesses. Frankly, I have one they can have about every other day, but women still want to start their own small businesses. And one of the things in procurement contracts, it was started in the Clinton administration, discontinued by the Bush. It would be great to invoke it again. In all government procurement contracts, they required the companies to turn in data on pay for men and women. Nothing they could do about it. Couldn't not give you the contract or award you extra points. But just that process made companies aware of it and had a dramatic impact. Because who wants to go apply? Do you really want to risk your Pentagon billion-dollar contract because you're not paying your women enough? No. And so once that was revealed, it was a major push toward pay equity. And finally, it's back to the future. Many of the things that women were concerned about in 1992, they are concerned about again. And two of them that really come to mind. One is education. Education is a huge issue right now for women. And if you look at, just hypothetically, because we're C3 here, if you look at Obama versus Romney, Obama versus Gingrich on the economy, they're even. The Republicans and the Democrats are even on the economy. When you have an economic message that includes education, the Democrats pull up ahead. Education is a key economic policy, and it's women that shift it that way. And the other thing that women are really concerned about is the next generation. You now have a solid majority of Americans who believe their kids will be worse off than they are. And that is a fundamental violation of what this country is supposed to be about. It's a fundamental violation of why you work your tails off in 2.5 jobs so your kids can be better. And frankly, it's a fundamental violation of why you put up with those extremely annoying teenagers because they're supposed to be better off. If that doesn't happen, the whole equation kind of falls apart. So a lot there has happened and a lot more that we can talk about as the panel goes on.
Well, thank you for having me here. Thank you to the Aspen Institute. I'm glad to be here. You know, as I think, you know, at the White House, I work with the Domestic Policy Council, as David said, heading up our mobility and opportunity team, really focusing on economic mobility and economic opportunity. My team works on issues ranging from workplace flexibility to childhood obesity and nutrition policy to the traditional income support and safety net programs to job training, workforce, labor issues. You know, as I work each day, day in, day out, on these issues of economic mobility and opportunity, and as I was preparing for this conversation that I'm looking forward to with all of you, and I think about women and the economy and women being drivers of the economy, I have no further to look than my own mother. My mom was a single mom, and between my mother and my grandmother raised me, and I am a poster child for economic mobility. You know, I was raised in a low-income community, a low-income family, and through various policies. My mother is by no means a policy expert in economic mobility, but as I work on these issues, I realize that she's as much of a policy expert as any of us. She intrinsically understood what was needed for me to have the opportunities that I have, from access to education to mentorships and the like. And so as I work on these low-income issues, I work with that experience in mind, and I can say undoubtedly that the president does too. His experience is not very different from mine, with a single mother, being raised by a single mother with the help of his grandparents, with his experience and work in Chicago as a community organizer. He understands the issue of economic opportunity. There's a lot of talk lately of income inequality, and I think in conjunction with income inequality, something that's very important to the president is to make sure that we have policies and initiatives that also promote economic mobility and opportunity. With that, I'm going to stop because I know that we're a little bit behind time. So,
Thank you. So maybe let's start with a sort of overview of the facts right now, which is from the research that I've looked at, we see the overall pay gap close still each year. But if you try to separate that out into a couple of different things, the only reason basically it's now still closing is because women are, in an overall sense, still closing the education gap. And in a sense, if you're just looking at people in their 20s and 30s, women are widening their lead, right? But if you strip out education and you are trying to control identical men and women of the same education, experience, industry, after closing quite markedly in the 70s and 80s, that so-called unexplained pay gap is no longer closing. Right. And that unexplained pay gap can be anything from outright sexism to latent sexism to different choices that workers are making. It's possible that even with all opportunities open to them, fewer women would become hedge fund managers than men. We don't know because we're not at the point of having all opportunities open to people. I guess I'd be interested in hearing all of your thoughts about what specific changes we could have, whether it's policy or whether it's voluntary stuff by industry, right now that could begin to get that unexplained gap falling again as it used to be. I think right now the unexplained gap is something like 10%. You take an identical man and woman, and the woman makes about 92% of what the man does.
I have two practical steps. Well, one I've mentioned, which is, in Norway they have quotas for women on boards. And they've achieved that over a period of years, 40%. And I participated in a number of debates about the American system doesn't like quotas and doesn't like forced diversity, but nonetheless there are a number of countries around the world, Australia and others, that are either doing this or putting it forward. And that's what I was saying, that's where we've observed the pay gap closing, is when you have women at the very top and they influence that. The other thing is convince Harvard to start taking women right out of undergraduate school into business school. This is a subtle observation, but it used to be that business school was treated like law school and medical school, and you pretty much went to it right out of undergraduate school. And then as soon as women hit the workforce in force in the mid-'70s, lo and behold, by 1982 or something, all the major business schools had changed their, talk about mobility, had changed their policies that they wanted students who had been out in the workforce for a couple of years. Which meant if you're a woman graduating from college, and I realize I'm talking at a level of professional, but you get out of college at 21 or 22, and then you work for a few years, and then at 25, 26, you move to another city, go to business school, and then you get out at 28, 29, and then you go put your roots down at 30. I have two daughters that are 20 and 23. That's not for them. They don't want to move around like that. And there's been a marked drop in women in business schools, which is really where, it may be creeping up a little bit, but I just go back to that decision, which at the time no one pointed out as a gender decision. It was never mentioned as a gender decision, but had the absolute effect of reducing the number of women that went on to business school in that generation.
And med school is actually an interesting comparative point there, because the pay penalty for taking time off in medicine is lower than it is in many other white-collar fields. And some of the reason for that, it seems, is that you can get through your medical training, as hard as it may be, much earlier, right? You can actually get through much of it by 27 or 28, and that just opens up more opportunities for you than some of these other things. What other?
No, go ahead.
2 points I'll just raise really quickly is, the president time and time again has implored and asked Congress to pass the Paycheck Fairness Act. I think that as we look at equal pay and the pay gap, there is a lot that we can do, in the private sector and in the private community, but there is some things that need legislative action. And where those things lie, we have been pushing and imploring Congress to take action in that space. In absence of action on the Paycheck Fairness Act, we continue to work at an administrative level. The president formed an equal pay task force to look at equal pay, at least within the government. And as folks have talked about the stats and the data around equal pay, the federal government pay gap is much less than it is out in the private sector, but there is still one there. And so looking at what we can do to put our house in order and to try to lessen that gap as well.
I'm not a policy person. I don't play one on TV. But I can tell you a couple of things that test very well with the voters. One is tougher enforcement of equal pay. So this is very important in the voters' minds, too. They believe these laws are not enforced in a tough enough way. And it's wildly, wildly popular. It's very popular. Not only is it popular for presidents to do, and it's an issue still in Congress. You can beat members of Congress over voting against equal pay, but it's also very popular for governors to do in their states. And in 2 years from now, we'll have a record number of governors up. So there's a possibility of setting the agenda there. Two, this procurement issue. If we really had every government entity, local, state, and national, and there are many government entities now that are making a major push to have more women, including the federal government under President Obama, to get more women contractors in federal procurement. But if every company had to turn in their pay stats, I guarantee there are a lot that would just feel like, one, it would be eye-opening to them, and two, it would feel like it's just not worth it to take this pressure. We don't want this publicly available. Third, and I'm also not a lawyer and I don't play one on TV, but I think it was a major setback to not have the Walmart case decided in a different way. And we were doing some research on it. Women thought it was absurd that they were considered too big to be a class, and that principle that it couldn't be discrimination because it was too big a class, women just thought was like absurd. And very much like saying women, which the National Women's Law Center has been wonderful on, that women are a pre-existing condition, which was a very motivating thing in the healthcare debate as well. And then the last thing, and it's interesting, we can get microlending going in Palestine, but we can't get microlending going in Pennsylvania. When women really want to start their own small businesses, and many women are very cautious about their own small business. They don't want a major loan. Women are financing their small businesses more than men, or at least reported, on credit cards, which is an unbelievably obscene way to try to finance your business. Microlending in this country would be very helpful to getting women. A lot of women just want to exit this game. Go make my, I'll do my thing, I'll make my money, I'll pay myself a fair wage, I'll pay my employees a fair wage.
With Walmart off the board, do any of you have thoughts about what the best way is from a political or policy or legal standpoint to pursue some of these outright discrimination issues?
I don't have a legal, but what's bouncing around in my mind is that as investors, and there's now a huge outpouring, something called Principles for Responsible Investing, over several $1 trillion worth of assets by over 1,000 pension plans that have signed on to these principles. And what a lot of us have as investors and as asset owners of the pension funds is voting rights in proxies and shareholder advocacy, and we're very active in that, but we don't have this on our advocacy agenda. So what I'm bringing back to Calvert is pay equity. It's such an old issue in a way. Yeah. It's so, and forgive me, some efforts have been a little misguided by creating more regulation. I do think it has to be done in a sort of leverageable way at the top or via legislation, but perhaps I can try to get this back on the agenda for the investment community to tackle this. I'm encouraged by the fact that it's wildly popular, because certainly you want to do things that within a pension community you cover everybody. It's important. So David, I'm encouraged to go try that.
I promise not to go down the rabbit hole of research on this, but there is, for people who are interested in it, there is some interesting debate among economists about if we really did a better job of controlling for things, what the pay gap is. Some people think it's closer to 8 or 10%, and some people think it's smaller, that we're missing some of those other things that you control for, and that when you actually look at identical men and women, we've actually made more progress.
Although one of the things that women would say is, and I don't mean to play with you, but look at identical men and women, isn't that kind of like an oxymoron?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right.
So women say, listen, our experience isn't the same. When men can have babies, then we can have identical experiences.
That's right.
So women actually have a very, and this is why it's so popular, and men buy into it. They have a very elaborate theory about why this occurs, and how our society is, that there ought to be even more aggressive policies than just equal pay.
Yeah.
I don't know, Duffy, I'm not the moderator here, but you're the lawyer.
I'll start over there.
Well, we first of all, we're working, and Emily Martin from our office is year on legislation to try to address the Walmart problem very directly. But I think that the point that Celinda just made, I'll pick up on a little bit. The women aren't really in the same situation even when you make those controls. And no one's yet mentioned the kinds of supports that women need to be in the workforce, particularly low-wage women. And not only are we not increasing our money devoted to things like child care or only making incremental progress on things like paid leave, but in 37 states last year, women were worse off in terms of the child care assistance they got than they had been just the year before. So it takes, and unfortunately, we're obviously in a situation where the economy isn't contributing well to our ability to do this. But it's very distressing that the debate is about deficits as opposed to investments, and about getting the economy going and giving women some of the support, especially low-income women, they need to be employed. And on the issue of continuous employment, I think that's a very interesting point. But again, we had in the Recovery Act that was passed in 2009 provisions to encourage states to improve their unemployment insurance programs in ways that particularly benefit women, so that if they leave the workforce because they have family reasons, or if they're in a part-time job, they can still get unemployment even as a part-time worker. And there were incentives in that bill which many states picked up on because they were money to improve their programs. But now we see states beginning to cut back on that, and South Carolina being just one of the most recent examples. So, as Celinda said, it's hard for anybody almost now to have continuous employment, but certainly not having unemployment insurance doesn't bridge those gaps, and particularly having an unemployment insurance program that is responsive or more responsive to women's concerns is important.
I think that Duffy and Celinda raise a really good point about the fact that, as much as you can control for certain differences, that it's not a apples to apples comparison, and that especially for low-wage women workers, it's certainly not an apples to apples comparison. Duffy rightfully mentions things like childcare and the supports needed for low-income women to be able to work, and workplace flexibility has been mentioned already. And I think that all these things are a key part of being able to provide this economic opportunity for women. And I can speak from my own experience that if my grandmother was not in our household, my mother would not have been able to work 2.5 jobs and provide me the education opportunities I had. So these things are really important as we talk about these things in the workplace flexibility. But one other piece that we've talked about a little bit is pay transparency. And I think what's also very important is knowledge. Knowledge is power, and a lot of these women don't know that they're making less than their men counterparts. And I mean, think about if you are a low-wage women worker, and your job is your lifeline, and being able to, and you think that if by trying to find out how much you're making, what the consequences of that may be. So there are a lot of aspects that go into this, I think.
Are there ways to have more transparency about pay? Meaning, are there specific legislative or executive?
Paycheck Fairness Act. Paycheck Fairness Act. Within the Paycheck Fairness Act, transparency is a key piece. If you look at Lilly Ledbetter, which is the first legislation that the president signed in his administration, Lilly's issue was that she didn't know. I mean, that was the issue at hand for Lilly Ledbetter. And so transparency is key, and Paycheck Fairness Act will address that.
And how would it do it? What would companies have to disclose?
Companies, I mean, and Duffy may know a little bit better about the specifics of the issue, but companies would have to, under the Paycheck Fairness Act, would have to provide the transparency of how much, well, actually, let me rephrase that. What companies, it would no longer be, I don't want to say illegal, but prohibited from retaliation. Thank you. I'm like, illegal is the wrong word. But within a company, some companies have policies on the books right now where you can be retaliated against. There can be consequences for trying to find out how much you're making,
Okay.
or for telling. And so one piece of this is, of the Paycheck Fairness Act, is this transparency piece. So it doesn't require companies to provide transparency, but it no longer has the disincentive to finding out.
Okay. So
And by the way, just to add to that, 40% of people think that they are in jobs right now that if they told their salary to someone else, they could lose
Even
their
if it's
job.
not a policy.
That's right.
Even if it's not a
They
policy.
believe that that's what their bosses want.
Yeah.
And the second thing I would say is we would be very remiss not to point out that one of the biggest forces that equalizes the wages between men and women is to have a union. however you're measuring the pay gap, it diminishes significantly, and in some industries down to nothing if you have a union. So I think it's organizing at the top, but also organizing within. And of course, unions are being decimated systematically right now.
Where are each of you on this question for particularly childcare and preschool education of universal versus targeted? The argument for a universal is that it gets everyone in the system, right? It creates buy-in for the more influential upper middle class constituents, a la Medicare and Social Security. The argument for targeted is we have limited resources, and we may never get to universal daycare or preschool, and so we should start in the places where it would make the biggest difference with the people who might need it the most.
You mean where are voters at?
Well, sure, but also where individually, where are each of you?
Well, I don't have an opinion, I guess, but I'll tell you where voters are at, which is universal programs do test a lot better. Now, the good news is you can make programs sound universal to people in such ways that they actually serve more targeted populations. One of the ways for that, for example, is to say it's available on a sliding scale. Then people think, oh, that's great. It makes it more affordable, but if you really need it or everybody's eligible. The other thing is there's a big difference between like child care and preschool education, and you were coupling those. People really committed to preschool education and really believe that we should be investing in education. And so in some ways I think in these, and they think that their states have cut education too much, and they think that this is a very unwise cut, and women really think this. And even in conservative states like Kansas and Texas, over 2/3 of voters think education's been cut too much. Number one argument against the governors in both states. So my instincts would be in these tough budget times, one of the ways to go at this is to emphasize more the education piece. And obviously you always want to say voluntary. But voluntary preschool is a way to get real people to the voters to the table to put some money on the table for these programs.
What is each
I
of
know
you?
other people may have.
I mean, I think that, you know, from an early education standpoint, this is an issue that is very important to President Obama and sees it as a critical piece as we look at cradle to career and building our economy. You know, I think there are two issues within the early education childcare space. One is access and one is quality. And, you know, as part of the Recovery Act and in this administration, we have tried to increase access to child care subsidies and to early education programs. But I think in addition to that, we've also looked at quality. You know, one statistic that is just heartbreaking is that for low-income children, on average, they start well behind their contemporaries once they set foot into kindergarten, and that's just uncalled for. We can't outbuild other countries. We can't be the best nation we can be if there are 1/3 of our population on the sidelines and don't have the access and opportunity to the education and to the opportunities that are needed to be able to build the economy. And I think early education is where it starts, and making sure that we have quality early education for all children. But I think that the targeted approach of looking at, you know, children where their families may not be able to afford child care, where child care is a necessity in order to promote economic mobility, is key and an important issue to the president.
And if I can add to that, we tested this notion of the falling behind in kindergarten. It was one of those, usually facts don't really make that much difference to voters. And as pollsters, you have to be really comfortable with that. But this was a fact that really bothered them, and I'll never forget one outraged woman in a focus group said, listen, this is America. In America, you can't flunk kindergarten. That's just wrong. We are not flunking anyone from kindergarten in this country. Right. And so I think that we're really underutilizing that, that kids are starting, people don't want kids to start that far behind. Yeah. They really think it's wrong. They don't care where you come from, they think that's wrong.
And when you combine your two responses, it's almost like what you're describing is something that is universally open, but above a certain level, you might essentially have to pay your own way.
Yeah.
It becomes one of your choices along with the more private ones. Let's spend our last couple minutes before opening up the discussion on some of the family structure issues. I'd be interested in a diagnosis from any of you who want to venture one about why this has become a growing problem over the last few decades, and then some thoughts about what some of the more promising either policy or private sector initiatives might be to deal with it.
Would you define
Yeah, what's
what
this?
you mean by
Problem?
family structure?
The
And
fact
what do
that
you mean
so
by
many
problem?
kids are now not born into two-parent families, so much more so than, and maybe your answer is it's not a problem. My reading of literature is that it is, but
Well, I'll give a corporate sort of and I'll address the other question too, which is the multi-generation, the children. Corporations have come a very long way in 20 years in terms of their focus on availability of childcare for workers. I mean, whether it's, is it Bright Horizons or whatever, there's sort of this whole movement and the best places to work and attract, do I have that right?
yeah, it is. It's Mitt Romney's firm helped start it, so
well,
he
too bad.
mentions it at
Okay,
nearly
sorry.
every debate.
Well, there were
Right.
many of
There
them.
were many others. and certainly at Calvert and Bethesda, we're not big enough to have our own in-house childcare, but having a childcare in the building available is huge. It's a huge benefit to attracting workers. So I think the corporate world recognizes this. I think we've gone one step further in terms of, it's not about flexible workplaces. Everybody loves to talk about that. Yes, that's important. But flexibility that's locked in is not flexibility.
Right.
What constant flexibility is yesterday when the federal government opens at 11 and everybody has their kids to worry about till 11 o'clock because, or whatever happens, they've got to, I guess it's the other way around when the schools don't open till 11 and they've got to get to work at 9. So Calvert has a policy, you bring your kids anytime. There's no take our daughters to work day. You could bring them anytime. And sure enough, there were a couple little ones running around yesterday because parents had to go to work and kids didn't have school. And I think there needs to be just a greater appreciation of that need that's an unscheduled flexibility. The other thing I would mention, because they're not in this room or represented, is the Girl Scouts, and I do serve on the Girl Scouts USA board, serve 5 million young people. Leadership parity in one generation is the mantra these days. We're celebrating the 100th year this year. Girl Scout troops are set up in low-income communities, paid for by the Girl Scouts in order to in essence, fill that gap of a family where you don't have a leader, you don't have parents who have the ability to volunteer. What the Girl Scouts are doing and I'm a new board member, so I'm excited about all the energy that goes into this, but when you have 6, 7, 8-year-olds, that's where you can make a difference too. And I think encouraging, supporting, and obviously recognizing these efforts that are outside of any sort of governmental policy or funding, but are truly extraordinary in their efforts to change gender leadership in one generation is the goal.
Wow.
Celinda or Racquel, any other thoughts?
I will say on the family structure question, I think that, more and more families are being raised in single-parent households. I shared with you that I was also raised in a single-parent household. And, of course, there are more difficulties and challenges being raised in a single-parent household. But I think what's important, and, I think what the president thinks is important as well, is not whether or not it's a two-parent household or a single-parent household, but that both mother and father are in the child's life. And that's what's really key, both from a financial standpoint, but also from an emotional standpoint. We have many programs that through the administration, but specifically child support, that really looks at, it's one of our ongoing programs that really reaches out to especially low-income fathers, but non-custodial parents, to try to incorporate them into their child's life. And the president has taken on fatherhood as one of the key values that he's really passionate about. I think one of the things that folks feel, no matter where you stand, is that the president is a good father. And I think that that's something that's very important to him, again, from a personal standpoint as well. And as we look at fatherhood initiatives that we've done, both from a public-private partnership, but also through the child support program and other things like our healthy marriage and fatherhood grants, responsible fatherhood grants, again, what's the most important, although there are challenges and obstacles, and no one is saying there aren't in single-parent households, are not to disparage single-parent households, but to make sure that a child has both parents in their lives.
Are there any policy steps, and then I'll open it up right after this, that can be taken to help so many women now who are essentially trying to juggle the responsibilities of family without a partner and also work their way up? Because we are, even if we could move, I agree with you that sort of moving to a world in which more fathers are involved would be a great thing. It also seems like there needs to be some effort to help the women who aren't going to have that happen because there's so many of them. I don't know if there are any policy steps that can make a difference.
Ironically, being at Aspen, I think one of the most creative, well, first of all, let me say this. We can worry about the structure of families, but those horses are out of the barn, to use a Montana phrase. We're at 50% unmarried now. We're not getting that genie back in the bottle. And I worry a lot about some of the, and we don't, it isn't like the Gen Yers want to be married in record numbers, far from it. And we now have two generations, Gen X and Gen Y, whose parents were heavily divorced. So they believe one way or the other, you know, you can be just fine, single parents. So they're not particularly feeling any pressure. And, you know, we could have a long philosophical feminist discussion about whether this would even be good. The second thing is there's a lot of stigmatization going on. And single moms and everyone express that people look down on single moms. So I think we have to be very careful in this conversation. That said, ironically, Aspen, I think, or maybe not ironically, it's a great place to end, as I think developed in Ascend, which is this two-generational strategy toward dealing with poverty, one of the more creative models here, which is, and people just loved it in the focus groups that we did, and there's a report out there where you combined children and the parents, and everybody got better together, and people just loved that idea. They thought it was a very wise investment. It also wasn't a surgical intervention, it was a holistic approach. And when you talk about policies, these women, many of these single moms, very aware of a lot of policies out there, interestingly, but they said, you know, okay, I get this policy, but there's no transportation money, so how am I supposed to get from this policy to that policy? And this holistic approach was very appealing and seemed very realistic. So I think that looking at some of these more innovative and new approaches that are more holistic, that are dual generation, I think is a great way to talk about this.
Great. Who wants to jump in? Do you want to handle it? Or you want me to?
Why don't we let the audience pay? Let's get the
Audrey Shepard. I'm an independent consultant. Thank you. And we haven't talked at all about small business owners, independent people starting their own very small business. It might just be them, or it might be a hairdresser, or it might be any number of things. And I may be the only person in this room who didn't know this, but recently it was explained to me that as an independent consultant, I pay both sides of my Social Security. Maybe I should have known it forever ago, but because I've been one for a long time. But, you know, it was being explained to me why my Social Security payment is so high. And I'm also not the world's heaviest policy person, but immediately I said, you know, if we're going to help women get a leg up, I know tons of women are independent small business owners, there should be a break on that for women. So I don't know if that's a good policy idea or not exactly, but there's, you know, it's a potential one to think of ways that as you encourage women, especially in an economy where there aren't a lot of jobs, to get women to, or people going into owning small businesses to have some tax incentives. So I throw that out.
So, and one thing is we're going to go through, because I want to be respectful of your time. Maybe you might need to get back to the White House and a few.
It's just the State of the Union.
Okay.
So
We want you to get back in time to rewrite it.
We did promise our panel that we would allow them to leave at 1:30, and I want to at least give Racquel a fighting chance to get back, or she can just call home and say, I'm being lobbied, I must stay. But what we might do, being the sort of the efficient women and smart women that we are, is kind of go around, people can put their hands and do a quick question, or very quick question, and then I'm going to ask the panelists to have a chance to say a final word and respond to it as best, because there's so much expertise in here, and we have 8 minutes. And so if people can just put your hands up, and we're going to go around rapid fire. So just Olivia.
Quick question. OPM had a pilot a year and a half ago, I think, on the results-only work environment, which is, as you were saying, taking flexibility to another level, pioneered by Best Buy. I hadn't seen how that had ended up, and if I know they were thinking maybe they would expand it if it went well, if there were any results from that.
Great. Passing down to Lori.
Hi. I just wanted to add something that actually builds on what Audrey was saying, and that's this issue of economic empowerment for women and girls, and the anchor of that is really economic literacy. I think that so many young women are disadvantaged from the moment they go into the workforce because not only do they not have economic literacy skills, but they also have no negotiation skills. And negotiation is so critical in pay equity. And we do so little to really empower girls, to give them the language and the voice to talk about economic literacy and long-term financial security. And I could go on, but I'm going to pass the mic.
We appreciate that. And Michaela, not everybody has to talk, but feel free.
Some of us can't help it. Donna Butts, Generations United, and I just want to encourage, when you talk about a dual generation strategy, what we've heard today is we really need to look at a multi-generational strategy.
Yeah.
The important role that grandparents play in helping to raise children, provide support for a next generation. But also when you think about caregiving needs, you talked about the fact that your company couldn't afford to have a child care center on site, but have they considered an intergenerational shared site which provides elder care and child care? Because it's that caregiving from a sandwich perspective. And those are some really rapidly growing and very popular programs where you can drop your child and your parent off at the same facility.
Appreciate that. Michaela, if you can grab them.
Hi, Barbara Galt with the Institute for Women's Policy Research. I think it's important to note when talking about the so-called explained elements of the gender wage gap that some of those do represent structural discrimination, and one that wasn't mentioned much was occupational segregation. So when those controlled studies are done, they control for occupation and industry, which means that in just trying to act on the unexplained piece, we're not dealing with the fact that women and girls are socialized to go into lower paying fields, and that's one of the big steps we can take.
Hi, Wendy Chun-Hoon, Family Values at Work. I was really encouraged by the points made earlier about discontinuity and the impact on men and the impact on women, especially in today's economy. And I'm just thinking about, Barbara, some of your points on leadership pipelines for women into top-level positions and corporations. And Celinda, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the polling shows that for policies like paid sick days and paid family leave, that women business owners aren't actually overwhelmingly in support of these types of policy changes. And so how do we think about sort of your comments in light of that, Barbara, and thinking about achieving these policy changes or ramping up those women business owners that are in favor of these policies?
Awesome. I mean, because we are bipartisan at the Aspen Institute, so I don't want to give too much time to the left side of the room, the centrists and the our side. But if people can just sort of really quick questions, because I want to give everybody a chance to get a voice, and the panelists to have a minute or two to respond. I have a word, and then David will say the final word. So just real quick, practice your soundbite. Thank you, Jennifer.
Jennifer Tucker from the Center for Women Policy Studies. At the center, we're really concerned about post-secondary education as a way out of poverty. And right now, as we're in this economic turmoil, I'm concerned that our young women, especially young women of color, may see college not as the right option for them, not as the right place to be, because so many women are now graduating and can't get jobs. What can we do?
Yeah, that's really true.
Raise your hands over here so Sarah can.
For mine, because the questions are already so good.
Okay, great.
Anybody else?
Anybody over here? Really? Oh, okay, God, yeah, I feel like I've been. Okay, Peggy, and then we'll go down.
I just have a quick point. The title of this session is Women, the Untapped Engine in the Economy. If you just step back and you look at sort of the crisis that U.S. is in, so many countries, the issue of women's employment has really paid a dividend for growth, pure economic growth. So if some of the policies we're discussing today would translate into more productivity and growth in the economy, what are your thoughts about that? Why are we not looking at it more as an economic equation? And then secondly, I just want to say tonight, apparently next to Michelle Obama is going to be sitting Warren Buffett's secretary, who pays more taxes than he.
Oh, that's
so
cool.
This notion of, the heralding the unsung secretary, heroine, the great hardworking, struggling forever. Thoughts on that and how it's going to play out tonight.
So I don't want to fully co-opt this panel, but I see a lot of friendly faces in the audience, and I could play the policy expert on small business and women, and know there were a couple questions on that. But why do that when my colleague is here, Christine from the National Economic Council at the White House, who works specifically on small business and women issues. And Christine, I don't know if you had any question or any responses to the, I'm just putting her on the spot here, but any responses to the small business and women.
I'll keep it very short as well.
Christine,
I think the point.
Chris.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
I'm pretty loud usually. I think the point that Celinda made earlier about procurement is a very important point. We've taken, in the Obama administration, we issued the women's contracting rule, which was signed into law during the Bush administration and never implemented. Seeing that federal agencies who all have a goal of making 23% of contract awards to small businesses now have a separate goal on making awards to women-owned small businesses. And that's an important step on the procurement side. In terms of tax policies, I think that's a very good point. One of the, similarly, self-employed people who own their own businesses and don't employ others also pay all their own health care and aren't able to deduct that as a business expense. And in the Small Business Jobs Act in 2010, we were able to pass for 1 year a policy where self-employed were able to deduct taxes. And those are very important changes that are on our agenda and on our list and things that we return to. I think the points about financial literacy and mentorship are just right on, and we've been spending a lot of time and energy rebuilding some programs that had been stripped down in the previous years. So the Women's Business Center program at the Small Business Administration, we expanded that. We allowed those centers to become microlenders under SBA's microlending program. Yeah. We allowed them to use other funds and other pots of money to be working with their clients, not just in training and counseling, but also on the financial side. We've noted that women business owners need mentorship. I think that the problems you're talking about having more women on boards, having more women able to negotiate more equal salaries, comes down to mentorship and comes down to that experience that's passed from colleague to colleague. We've worked with the Startup America partnership. We've worked with different mentoring organizations and projects across the country, and we're going to be amping up those efforts as well to make sure that some of these issues can be addressed at an individual level. And I think the financial literacy is super important and falls right under there as well. I'm a graduate of Smith College, and they started right after I left something I'd been arguing and advocating for a long time, which is women in financial education. I left college not knowing how to run my finances.
Yeah. And I think, in addition to just kind of outside the small business space, we've done a lot of work around the mentorships piece and the financial literacy piece. We're doing a lot of public-private partnerships in that financial literacy space. We just recently had an announcement on January 5th of the Summer Jobs Plus program, which was a very popular program that was part of the Recovery Act for low-income youth. To provide them jobs in the summers and provide them that access and opportunity, and for them to see a world that maybe they had never seen. I mean, we had many stories of young people who had never really earned a paycheck before, and this was their first paycheck. And one of the things that we did this year, that was legislation as part of the Recovery Act. Congress, it was part of the American Jobs Act as well, but in the absence of Congress, we did a public-private partnership and got several of hundreds of companies to commit to hiring and to providing these opportunities to low-income youth. A piece of that this year is not just being able to provide jobs, but providing mentorships as well, and mentorship programs, job shadow days. And I think what's really important is to make sure that, especially for low-income youth, that they see the bigger picture. You were talking about women of color and higher education, and them, thinking it's not worth, when I do the cost-benefit analysis, I need to go to work instead of going and getting my education and possibly racking up thousands of dollars in debt. And I think part of that is providing these mentors who can show them that how important financial literacy is. I can say for myself, I say that I'm a poster child for economic mobility. One piece that now I can look back as an adult and recognize that was missing in my life was the financial literacy piece. My first boss, well, I guess with my second boss, after I graduated law school, I wasn't putting money into my 401k because I wanted it. Like, I needed that money to be able to pay my bills. And my boss, when he found that out, literally said, I will fire you. Because we had a pretty great matching rate, and the fact that I wasn't taking advantage of that, he just couldn't understand. But that wasn't something I grew up with and something that I understood. And so I think it's really important for folks to have mentors, whether it be about the small business and women in small business, but also for young people, women and boys.
I appreciate that. Barbara, then Celinda.
Oh, I just want to thank you for being here. I don't want to take more time. Everybody's got to leave. And I'm right here in town, and visit calvert.com and visit UN Women and read up on the women's principles. So thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. And one thing I just want to say on Barbara, she didn't sort of say this, but when we also think about women's leadership at the top can change how a sector operates. Barbara is one of the first people that we all think about social screens. When you do get the talk from the boss that says, are you putting money into your 401k, you have an option to hit a socially responsible fund. And Barbara is one of the women.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. And
We're in
so,
6,000 401k plans. So if your 401k plan
we think about the changes we make both as mentors and in policy and in practice. And so I just, when we think about the financial sector, had a few more women in charge, we could have saved a lot of headaches. But Celinda.
The only thing I will say is, first of all, thank you to everyone. And I just want to emphasize that as we are on the eve of the State of the Union, what's interesting about these policies is they are very popular with the public, too. And as progressives, we desperately need an economic vision here. We are not communicating an economic vision. And frankly, a woman-led economic vision is going to be very, very popular with the voters we need to get.
I appreciate that. One thing before we let you go, and David has the final word, is when we think about it, it's the first time that the majority of Americans don't necessarily a future for our children. One of the few subgroups of our population are actually single mothers. And I think how we really think about my colleague, Peggy, who's on the global stage every day, she just flew in from Ghana to be here with everybody. We're so comfortable talking about the power of investing and supporting women internationally. What does it mean to bring that home here in the U.S. and talk about it, about women? We are right now at a crisis point with more than 40% of our children growing up in a low-income family. Relationships are different. It's not about right or wrong and how people choose to live, but how are we structuring community colleges, 50-year anniversary of Head Start? How are we thinking about how we re-engineer how the world works so it makes sense with our lives, because we need that as an economy. And so I just think harnessing also that strength and resilience from women across the economic ladder has a great opportunity. So there'll be more conversation with Ascend February 15th. If you're free, see Nisha. We'll be doing some follow-up conversation more specifically about this, but I really also, before he has the final word, really thank David Leonhardt. We all know what it's like. The press can define how we discuss issues in the country, certainly in Washington and beyond, but he really has been a very thoughtful leader about putting the issues out there for the country to at least read about. So I want to thank him again for taking his time with us here today.
Thank you.
Last word, David.
Thank you. So I'm inherently skeptical of have your cake and eat it too arguments. I'm skeptical of the notion that universal health care, as important as it may be, will lower health care costs. But I actually think this is a have your cake and eat it too argument. And this comes back to your productivity point, which is I think the main argument for these sorts of issues is an equity argument. But there's also an efficiency argument, as economists would say. If you look at how girls are doing in school today, whether it's from kindergarten all the way to postgraduate schools, they're out-competing boys at every level, at every single level. And then you compare that with the struggles of low-income women. You compare that with what the Fortune 500 executive suite looks like. And you think about the gap between those two. And that is just an enormous amount of untapped talent that can actually, economic growth is, to exaggerate, the solution to all our problems. It's the solution to the deficit. It's the solution to middle-class living standards. It's the solution to the United States' long-term role in the world. And so I think there really is a macro importance to all this. And thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you to Anne, and thank you to everybody for coming.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for joining us. It was awesome.
Just when I'm going to